The Twin Towers, you were drawn to it because it was just so magnificent and amazing.
The World Trade Center, and to me, being in construction, most skyscrapers, that's pure Americana. That's something we did, we invented, we exported.
As soon as I seen the plane crash, I knew it was automatically a terrorist attack, And then I just jumped in the car, felt like I had to just help out.
September 11th, 2001. As Charles Dickens might say, it was the worst of times, and yet it was also the best of times. The attacks on America that day saw horrific damage.
But those attacks also saw incredible courage. The coming together of people from all walks of life who ran into harm's way in a desperate effort to rescue others. The uniformed services, the police, the firefighters, and other first responders earned the admiration of the nation for their swift and unselfish actions.
But there was another group that also played an essential role that day and in the days that followed. In fact, without them, there would no doubt have been even greater damage and additional loss of life. They were the overlooked heroes at what became known as Ground Zero. They were the iron workers, the electricians,
architects, engineers, crane operators, carpenters,
and members of dozens of other trade unions and major construction companies.
They were organized and led by a small city agency that was virtually unknown at the time, the Department of Design and Construction, or more simply, the DDC.
This is their untold story. Join us now for Ground Zero, the Unsung Heroes.
About 4 blocks away when Tower 1 fell. Shortly thereafter, I actually went to the police headquarters command and control center and started mobilizing contractors.
I was dealing with the mayor and other commissioners on issues that involved the World Trade Center site, while Mike was dealing with the specific construction-related issues and organizing the immediate response.
Tully, they were already working in that area. We decided to call Bovis because we have requirement contracts with Bovis. We brought in AMAC. Turner was already at the site.
So we had our first meeting early in the afternoon in police headquarters with all kinds of city officials. And they said, well, there may be people entrapped within the buildings and we got to get going right away.
And you heard different reports, 6,000, 9,000. Nobody knew how many people that were, at the site.
The immediate need on the 11th was to really walk the site with the city and the main contractors and try to come up with a plan of attack.
And that's when we got the full flavor of, wow. Most of the people that were there, your mouth was open. You couldn't believe what you're used to seeing wasn't there anymore.
My first impressions were like, where did 2 110-story buildings go?
You hold back the tears and you just couldn't believe it.
The bucket brigades, just hundreds of people just frantically digging with 5-gallon plastic pails, just passing them down and accumulating them.
It reminded me of a war zone.
I think the most amazing thing that I saw was these great, huge box beams, and they were snapped like they were toothpicks.
You imagine in your mind what's the most horrible thing you could think of, right? This thing was twice as much.
There was glass falling out of all the buildings around. There was a piece of one of the towers wedged in the American Express building, hanging precariously.
It was a nightmare. It was hell.
There was fires in certain areas still burning. It just looked like Dante's Inferno.
And the odor. The odor is something that I'll never forget.
It's sort of like just charred everything. Charred steel, charred concrete, charred flesh.
I kept thinking to myself, if there is a hell, I'm right in it right now.
Everything that had World Trade Center in its name was destroyed. Buildings 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7.
We lined up the major, large construction companies. They lined up all their subcontractors. And one of the key components in the New York area to the engineering construction community is the GCA, the General Contractors Association, the New York Building Congress, and the Building Trades Employers Association. And on that first day, I reached out to all three organizations to make sure that they mobilized their members, because we didn't know what we needed.
That afternoon, people started to show up from all over the city and all over the country.
No one was getting paid. They were just trying to lend a hand. It was extraordinary.
Anybody who had anything that they thought could possibly be utilized on that job came down there and offered them up, no questions asked.
Every 2 seconds we were getting phone calls of people on 95 with cranes, with backhoes, with grapplers.
Nobody really knew who was in charge, and everybody wanted to be in charge.
It was just utter chaos. I mean, there was thousands upon thousands of people climbing over debris piles. Nothing was really organized.
Right through here, need a bucket line.
And it was just mind-boggling that you had long lines of men, 200 or 300 men in a line snaking up through the pile with buckets in their hands, and just, you know, the ludicrousy of trying to remove that pile with a bucket.
You needed heavy equipment and people very skilled in moving these debris quickly.
Getting that heavy equipment and the people who knew how to operate it became a race against the clock. Ground Zero, the Unsung Heroes, will be right back.
Here at Arise America, we want to bring you news from a different perspective, and not just news, but analysis as well. Tell me what it was like growing up gay in Uganda.
I have suffered sexual violence, including that has been planned by my family to heal me from lesbianism.
To have somebody lead your child away in handcuffs is just not something that should be done to a 12-year-old child.
You call this Victims Advocate Group, this phone number, which is sponsored by the Catholic Church, correct?
Right.
And what kind of response did you get?
They told me not to make prank calls and it wasn't appropriate and hung up the phone.
My God. Michael Dunn could go away for many decades. Is that enough for you?
No, it's not. The person that killed Jordan Davis has to be found guilty by a court of law in the United States of America.
Well, Arise is the only network that really covers comprehensively the African diaspora. It gives people in other parts of the world of color a chance to know about people here in the United States, us to know about them, and the world to know about us. So it's kind of an educational experience for everybody involved. Getting to know people through stories, through personal stories. You really get a chance to know what people are actually all about, what communities are about. How are we different? But more importantly, what commonalities we all share.
While the Twin Towers were its most iconic image, the World Trade Center actually encompassed 7 buildings grouped together in Lower Manhattan. On September 11th, all 7 collapsed, creating giant piles of broken, smoldering rubble.
Firefighters, police, and other emergency services quickly arrived, but 2 things became clear. The first responders needed help. They needed heavy construction equipment, as well as professionals with extensive knowledge of architecture and engineering.
The second realization was that the devastated area was so massive, so chaotic, and so dangerous it needed to be split into smaller, more manageable sections to expedite the search for survivors.
What I decided upon was actually dividing it into quadrants and giving each one of the major construction managers one quadrant. AMEC in the northwest, Turner in the northeast, Tully in the southeast, and Bovis in the southwest. And we established DDC as the program manager above them. And we married an engineering firm to each one of those construction companies to make sure we had an efficient, coordinated effort.
The reason we needed engineers married to the construction management companies is that there were so many engineering decisions to be made on a daily basis.
What was sinking in on me in the first hours of the attack after I got down there was, are we going to end up people dying because we couldn't get them? You know, that was something that was, I think, was gnawing at everybody.
First couple of days, we were brought in by FEMA, by the fire department, hazardous teams, and just anybody reaching out for some knowledge about maybe one stairway they might find to go down and be able to find some people that were there to be rescued.
There was always that hope that we were going to find a place that was bridged over and people were still alive, and we had to, you know, work as fast as possible to try to save those people that were still alive.
There used to be a bridge right here that went across called the North Bridge that connected 6 World Trade Center and the path tubes over to the World Financial Center complex, and it would go right into the face of the Winter Garden. That bridge was knocked down by the collapse of 2 on September 11th. If you looked early on, the first couple of weeks of the work, the main effort was to remove the debris of the bridge so that we could restore access down West Street. That was the big push in the beginning.
I can tell you in the first couple of days, one of the strongest memories I have was when they would blow a whistle and you're up on the pile and it would be complete and total silence. Honestly, you could hear a pin drop. No one breathed. And they dropped in their listening devices. And then when they found nothing or heard nothing, blew another whistle, people went back to work, hand over hand.
I think it was maybe Tuesday night, and I had walked out of the perimeter, if you would. There was like a little Red Cross station. I went, and they were actually giving out cigarettes. So I went to get a pack of cigarettes. And a woman came up to me with a photo of her son. And she said, please, please, can you help me? And just the look in her eye, panic, terror, I can't even describe it. It was just this pleading look. Please, can you help me find my son? I mean, it was dark, and if it wasn't the first night, it was the second night. It was very shortly after I'd gotten there. I was like, well, I don't know what to say. I mean, yes, I will. I will try and help you find your son.
The odds of finding survivors were grim. It's believed that the buildings contained about 25,000 people when the first plane struck at 8:46 in the morning. Incredibly, most got out, but about 2,800 did not.
And while area hospitals geared up to handle the expected flood of rescued injured, only a trickle came in. Now, accounts differ, but fewer than 24 people survived being trapped in the rubble.
As the search for survivors continued, there were other fears to contend with. Fears that the tremendous impact of the collapsing Twin Towers weakened the surrounding buildings, that more tons of concrete and steel could come crashing down on the rescue workers.
We started immediate evaluations of buildings in the area, and I think there were about 3 dozen of those that we considered significant to need to look at.
Of all the intact structure in this area, B3 in this corner is the worst. So I'm not sure where it hits that line over there.
Eventually, we looked at about 400 buildings very quickly in order to reopen parts of Lower Manhattan.
That first day, when I was taking the tour with Mike Burton and Richard Tomasetti and other people from Tomasetti's company, as well as some of the CMs.
We're looking up at the Bankers Trust building, which had this gaping hole in it. It was about 9 stories high.
And the firemen saw them, came up to them, and said, we don't have enough water pressure. We want to get up on top of that building there and tap into their water tanks.
And the fire chief wanted to know, was it safe to send his people to the top of that roof?
Now, a question like that, ordinarily, an engineer would want to go back to his office, take measurements, get the structural drawings, do a couple of weeks' worth of calculations before he gives them an answer, right? And it couldn't.
Not making a decision would have resulted in the fires not being fought and potentially people dying from the fires. But saying that it was safe to go into the building meant that you were going to have about 15 firefighters run into a building that was the most damaged building I'd ever seen in my life.
They made some quick judgments about the extent of the damage.
Recognizing the vintage of the building, we felt it did have a lot of redundancy, and we told them,
it's fine, go on up, stay toward the back. That kind of thing had to be done all the time.
When you're tasking the best of New York City's construction industry, the best of New York City's engineering industry, and asking them to come together to handle, a national disaster, you've got the A-team of A-teams.
The hurried inspections of the neighboring buildings indicated that none were in danger of collapse, but another hazard needed to be dealt with, and it required literally wrapping entire skyscrapers in protective netting.
There was lots of broken glass, and any wind could have taken the glass down and killed people.
Recognizing that on day 3, 4, and 5, there was still no electric of any kind. None of the elevators worked. We're talking about Liberty Plaza, I think it was 55 stories. Millennium was 50 stories. And our men had to walk up and down those stairs.
Within the first plus or minus week of the project, we netted probably something in the neighborhood of 24 buildings and over 1 million square feet of netting.
It was unprecedented. I did not have enough men. We picked up people from the Carpenters Union. When they ran out of people, we had laborers, we had iron workers, we had every trade. If you were not afraid of a height, if you could get on an electric scaffold, then you went out and you put up netting.
This was, again, an example of the unprecedented cooperation we had. In most circumstances, people are very careful about jurisdiction. Here, the name of the game was to get the job done, and the netting was the absolute critical first step to making sure that people felt they could work safely around the buildings that were left standing.
Of course, even while the netting and building inspections were taking place, the search for survivors was in high gear. Ground Zero, the Unsung Heroes, will return in a moment.
If I was building my own news network, I think I'd want broad, in-depth knowledge of important issues throughout the world.
I would want to recruit a fairly diverse staff that had different life experiences before they came to news.
We want to see how we can help ourselves and help benefit other people, and not just see what's up with the celebrities and where they're going and traveling and buying this and buying that.
If I were to build my own news network, it would certainly have to reflect a diversity of culture, because that's the global situation, that's the global reality.
I would probably bring a lot of personal stories, really personal stories from the leaders of all countries.
If I was to build my own news network, I would just have people from all over who are very connected and diverse.
Vice News, every culture, every angle.
One of the great things about Arise News, it is truly a multicultural global channel that is paying attention to communities of all different kinds, not just here in the United States, not just in Africa, but all around the world. As we're giving a voice to the people that don't traditionally have the kind of a voice that a mass media organization can have. You're getting here at Arise News that you're not going to find at the other networks is a unique perspective, and I think that's part of what Arise is here to do.
The fire department was very, very aggressive in wanting to get into the pit as quickly as possible. They wanted to find survivors if there were any, obviously their own personnel as well. And the idea was get me closer, get me closer.
They had reached a point where there was nothing more they could do by hand. And our hopes were with the cranes that we could, in an effort not to disturb the debris and further create a condition in which you might hurt someone who had survived, by crushing the debris, we would reach over and try to pluck away at the debris to hopefully find people.
People came out of retirement, came back from as far as Hawaii, came up from California, came up from down south. You know, people showed up here that had 40 years experience, 50 years experience.
It was what America does best, respond to crisis. From all parts of the country, more and more equipment arrived to help with the search and rescue.
Ironically, that same equipment almost caused greater disaster. Suddenly, there were two new terms that were being talked about with increasing anxiety: the slurry wall and the bathtub, the area encompassed by the slurry wall.
The slurry wall was a barrier separating the soil and water outside the site from the site itself. At its worst location, from a risk point of view, the slurry wall was about 165 feet away from the Hudson River. So if the wall were to collapse at that particular location, the Hudson River would have access to the site, and there would be an endless amount of water coming into the site. And it had the potential of being catastrophic.
The people who were first down at the site, they were not aware of the potential danger of putting additional loads on the outer side of the bathtub, the outer side of the slurry wall. Because when you press down on the soil and you have a wall that's here, when you press down here, it puts pressure this way, and many of the floors were damaged or totally destroyed that would equalize that pressure.
And initially, we didn't know what the condition of the wall was.
People put their life in jeopardy to go down into the basement area and to do the surveys and testing.
We've also been instrumental in the below-grade insertions because of our knowledge of the building and our relationships with Port Authority Police, Fire Department. We're the coordinators and the tour guides, if you will.
We're standing on the path platform adjacent to Track 5. We're looking at the footprint of One World Trade Center. To the right was tenant storage areas on the B5 level. Looking at the remnants of the building. You see a lot of steam pipes in this area. A little further down was our steam meter room. Also right behind that wall of debris was our refrigeration plant.
Many of the engineers involved with Muset Rutledge and with Lara, and some of our guys, just seemed to be fearless about going underground.
When Andrew and I were selected to go down to the site with George on that Sunday, we knew that basically we were unofficially tapped by George to be the ones to go and climb into the pile, climb underneath the debris, to travel the perimeter of the bathtub and to figure out what was intact, what was damaged.
We had a support crew of emergency service units of police, fire department, Port Authority Police. They were all our support team. And when when we went down with 3 or 4 people, we actually went down with 12 or 13 because they were there assisting us.
Was it scary? Yeah, sure. I mean, none of us were trained for this type of work. Definitely I wasn't trained.
There was never a moment to sit down and do a calculation. You had to exercise a judgment right then and there. I know that the police and rescue people look to them to make decisions on the structure, the suitability of going ahead somewhere. They performed admirably.
The slurry wall was holding for the time being. As the days wore on and hope died that any more survivors would be found, the mission changed from search and rescue
to deconstruction and cleanup. Fires were still burning. There were fears of leaking toxic gases and other environmental concerns. The imperative now was to remove the 1.5 million tons of tortured steel and other debris.
It was like looking at gigantic pickup sticks in the bathtub. So you had an area that was 500 by 1,000 feet, 70 feet deep, filled with pickup sticks. You didn't know if anything was going to settle, if anything was going to fall.
In the beginning, there was a constant fear of almost everybody. You know, if you move this one, what's going to happen? And there were, there was some people that were frantic. We have to.
Now, the position of the grapplers was critical because they had to be placed upon solid material. So there was areas where we knew that they would be over open void space, and we would have to exclude the grapplers from going on there.
A couple of times it got a little hairy, Power would shift, equipment would move.
Basically, we used a process called daisy chaining, where you couldn't reach with labor or trucks to move stuff out. So if we had a pile of beams that had to get out of the way, and maybe they were 200 feet away, we would take 2 or 3 of these grapplers, put them in a line, and pass one beam to the second grappler, to the third grappler, finally till you could get it off-site on a truck.
The second thing was, how are we going to get it out of here? How are we going to establish a trucking operation that makes sense?
The steel would come out red hot, that you could see glowing. I mean, it was scary. You'd put it on a truck, and again, I remember when the city said you have to cover all the loads because we don't know about asbestos or anything else that's in there. So you'd take it, you'd try to put a top on it, and the top would burn up.
So what we did is we came up with a shower system that a truck would drive through and cool the material. And then after it cooled the material, it would go to a tarping station and cover it.
We all saw that the only way you were going to get the thing done fast was to do it by water.
So we set up 2 barging stations, one on the east side, one on the west side.
But they didn't have a pier with draft deep enough to be able to do it. So, getting a barging permit, muck out, dredge the Hudson River, is a process that takes a tremendous amount of time.
Got a phone conversation together with all the entities, and I deployed our dredge earlier today, and they was sitting on site with the bucket hanging over the water while we're having a phone conversation. And in 45 minutes, we had a dredging permit over the phone, and we started dredging within the hour. We brought in some of our own operators from different unions.
And they worked out fantastic, where all the material just was barged, and we didn't have to take steel or any hazardous materials through the streets of New York.
Looking at mainstream news stations where only you have a very small minority of people of color being newscasters and actually having prominent roles in the media.
In a newsroom in the United States, maybe 10% of decision makers come from communities of diversity. That's not right.
Well, diversity is important because the more complete the news is, the more accurate a picture you're getting of the world, and the more you can form an accurate opinion of things.
The vision here is not just to tell the main stories of the day, but to tell the news that other organizations don't tell, and tell it in a way that people like me, people that look like me, that look like you, are interested in.
Arise News.
Arise News.
Arise News.
Arise News. Arise News, every culture, every angle.
Because we live in a global, interconnected world, business news no longer stops when the markets close on Wall Street. And what we've discovered over the past few years of the financial crisis is that events and news that happen even in the smallest countries impact the United States and the world at large. As we bring together experts and analysts and thought leaders and CEOs and companies across many industries to not only provide the macroeconomic view, but news everyday people can use.
A firefighter's wife came down and tried to get to the North Tower to throw some roses and a picture of her husband in the North Tower. She couldn't make it in, so she asked us if we could do it for her.
2,753 people perished when the buildings came down.
343 firefighters and paramedics died.
So did 60 officers from the City and Port Authority Police Departments.
As the crews worked to deconstruct what became known as the pile, a heart-rending and painstaking task was taking place, sifting through the still smoking rubble, looking for remains.
If the firefighters thought for a minute that they saw something, we stopped the machinery, turned the boom around, backed it up, and we let them go in there by hand.
And if you do find someone, you stop the job dead in its tracks. And you go through a mini funeral mass.
Almost everybody that was in the area that could access would come up and form a line. And it was uniformed services, construction workers, DDC person, whoever happened to be there. And it'd be dead silence, and they would bring them up.
That's what it's like. I actually go into a funeral every day for 10 months.
It was a fight. The pile was fighting us. It wanted to stay, and we wanted to get it out of there. We wanted to find whatever remains we could and get it back to the families.
And we actually took some pride and some joy in that. You know, as much death was down there, that we were bringing closure to people. I mean, that's what the job turned into.
It was done with dignity and respect from the first minute I was there to the last minute that I left. And I can say that unabashedly.
We tried our best. We couldn't get everything.
I just remember this massive humanity out there and all of this debris, and just wondering to myself, how in the heck are they ever going to even be able to get in there and get anybody, if anybody's still alive, and how are we going to keep these people from getting hurt themselves?
So you don't think of construction as a normal response team, and construction workers are not trained to act as a response team.
The primary responsibility was for the worker safety. The most obvious was respiratory protection. We had to get respirators out to everyone. We had to have them fit properly. We had to have them understand the need, why they had to wear them.
Okay, basically what we do is we're going to try a respirator on, do a little field test that I'll show you how to do.
Each laborer is required PPE, personal protection equipment, hard hat, safety glasses, respirator, and a safety vest so you can be seen with reflective material on it. If you hear 3 horn blasts, whatever you're doing, stop and get out.
One challenge that we faced for about 3 months was the fact that the World Trade Center housed the largest chiller plant in the world. and they had 7 tanks of Freon. And our concern was that because the Freon was heavier than air, if there was a leak, it would displace all the oxygen in the hole and it would suffocate the workers.
We did a lot of probes, we did a lot of inspections, we did a lot of studies. Fortunately, the Freon became a non-issue.
We dealt with issues like ammunition, which was kind of unique for an occupational safety person to have to deal with, but we had that as well to deal with.
I've been in the safety business for over 20 years, and I've never seen anything of the magnitude of what we saw at that site. The twisted steel, the reinforcing bar, it still amazes me today that we didn't impale somebody on all that twisted rebar that was out on the site.
Well, actually, one time an excavator was pulling out some debris and a piece of metal flew off a rebar and just went right by this guy's head. And I was standing next to, I think it was Chief Rossweiler. And he looked at me and said, you know, God's a New Yorker.
The second challenge was trying to keep the police officers and the firemen from getting run over by the equipment. They are trained to dodge bullets and hand-to-hand combat kind of danger, but they had absolutely no concept of how dangerous it was to be around all these big trucks and cranes and you know, the kind of work that was going on.
Out of about 3 million work hours on this site in about 10 months of effort, we only had 35 people who lost time from the job, and they weren't seriously injured. Our accident record, after all was said and done, was better than what is typical for the construction industry in the United States.
Mainstream news has covered all of the issues of the world, which are like this, through a very narrow lens. And at Arise News, we do things different. We cover every culture, every angle. Our mission is to go to these places, to these communities, whether they're in Africa, whether they're in Europe, Asia, the United States, the Caribbean. And we're going to find these stories, and we're going to tell them to our audience. Stories that they probably never heard of before, and stories that they'll find interesting and engaging.
I think news does make people put things in black and white terms just so that they have a dividing line between what their viewers like and dislike.
When they see a person of color, they either think that they're not going to do anything, they're either on drugs or they got pregnant at an early age, and I just want to say that that's not true.
It tends to reflect more the interests of the upper income people and the upper income interests.
Arise News, every culture, every angle.
The great thing about Arise Entertainment 360 is that we cover the 360 of entertainment, food, fashion, lifestyle, culture. We're able to cover it all. And the thing I love most about the show is we're able to do a stunning combination of high and low. So we can talk about Rihanna on the red carpet, but we can also speak about high art with people like Sanford Biggers and Hank Willis. We actually spend quality time with our guests and we really get to know them. It's really intriguing because we get a 360 look at our guests.
When I first went down there, my first thought as I was standing there with my jaw open was the fact that we'll never get this cleaned up. It was just overwhelming.
One of the main challenges we had was that when we were cutting the facades down for Tower 2, as well as Tower 1, we couldn't just cut the beams and let them drop.
The reason we couldn't cut the beams and just let them drop is we did not want 100,000 pounds of steel crashing into the debris pile and causing further collapses.
And since it was determined that we couldn't pull it down in one piece, we had to give it a trim, cut it down in sections. And so they'd basically just stand in these baskets, the iron workers. One would pass the rod, the other guy would use it and ignite it and start cutting with this. It's almost like Star Wars with these very long lightsabers. It would slowly cut through steel.
And then eventually we were able to cut it enough to pull it over.
Two of the buildings were so wildly distorted, there was no sure place for the iron workers to cut. So a different technique had to be used.
And they took it down the old way with a slug and a crane, and they dropped it onto the building. It was just amazing to watch them go, those guys work, when they were taking down Building 4 and Building 5. The crane operator was an old-timer. He was going to retire, but he came back to do this job. He would sit there and he would look at Building 5. He would look at it, get back into the crane, position the slug, drop it 2-3 times, a whole section would come out. That's years of experience. And it was just amazing to watch the experience at work.
Lou Mendez gave us the order. It had to be down by the first of the year, and he didn't want to hear the second. It had to be down in December. We had promised him we'd make it, and we did make the date. Building 6 was a very unique building. The stuff that's been confiscated by U.S. Customs were there. The people from the government wanted to get into the customs house to go through it. And they were walking through, and they had to get into a room, and there was a hole in the wall, and the hole was probably 3-4 feet high to climb over the wall. So our guys grabbed what they thought were bricks, and they made a staircase for everyone to walk over and down. And we later found out we made a staircase out of kilos of cocaine that were confiscated that were sitting in the customs house.
There's a race against time to rebuild, but it was challenging in that you knew the primary goal was to remove the debris. And my goal was to keep the systems running and to plan for the rebuilding and to stay out of the way of the removal of debris.
I think actually from the street perspective and from the infrastructure perspective, in some sense, the collapse of building number 7 was probably the greater impact. You know, I don't mean that in any disrespectful way, but I think in terms of the utility infrastructure, that was really the greater impact than the 2 towers, and that's because in number 7 World Trade Center was the Con Edison substation that everybody has talked about, and also the streets that surrounded that building had tremendous concentration of utility lines on Barclay Street to the north and Vesey Street to the south, going to the Verizon central office at 140 West Street, right across from the World Trade Center. And many of those lines were knocked out when that building fell and needed to be rerouted.
We had gotten a call, I think on the radio actually, that there had been a noticeable shift in the south slurry wall.
It was very frightening because it started as a small crack, and then it turned into a crack of about 10 inches along Liberty Street. I've only seen things like that when we've responded to emergencies due to seismic occurrences, earthquakes. And I must tell you, there were 2 or 3 nights there that were quite sleepless for most of us until that wall got stabilized, and it finally did get stabilized.
There are important technical issues as to how we go about removing debris that could possibly be bracing some other piece of structure, or more significantly could be bracing the slab that's bracing the slurry wall.
Very early on, I put together a set of drawings and an outline of what I thought had to be done on the recovery of the basement of the bathtub. And I outlined in that how it would be necessary to restore the anchors, to hold the wall back, just as had been done in 1967, 68, level by level.
We drilled a 45-degree angle. We put in what we call a trumpet, and then we sank cables that were tied into the bedrock. And then once the cables took into the bedrock, the grout basically cured. We then started tensioning the cables, and it pretty much brought the movement of the walls back into, uprighted them back into place.
Yeah, my grandfather, my father, along with this gentleman's here, his father, uncle, excuse me there, Jimmy. They worked on the foundation of the Trade Center in, in the late 60s, early 70s. Here we are again in a different setting. Dock builders out of 1456.
Ultimately, we installed 1,000, 1,100 tiebacks. I'm not sure what the exact final number was, but they did exactly what they were meant to do. They were meant to allow us to remove the debris from the bathtub and hold up the walls. The debris is gone, the walls hold, they worked.
Even as they worked on that twisted terrain of destruction and death, there was an effort to raise the spirits of those laboring at Ground Zero.
It took the form of a celebration more closely associated with peace on earth and goodwill towards men. We'll have that part of the story when Ground Zero, the Unsung Heroes, continues.
Here at Arise America, we want to bring you news from a different perspective, and not just news, but analysis as well. Tell me what it was like growing up gay in Uganda.
I have suffered sexual violence, including that has been planned by my family to heal me from lesbianism.
To have somebody lead your child away in handcuffs is just not something that should be done to a 12-year-old child.
You call this Victims Advocate Group, this phone number, which is sponsored by the Catholic Church,
right,
correct?
Right.
And what kind of response did you get?
They told me not to make prank calls and it wasn't appropriate and hung up the phone.
My God. Michael Dunn could go away for many decades. Is that enough for you?
No, it's not. The person that killed Jordan Davis has to be found guilty by a court of law in the United States of America.
One of the great things about Arise Entertainment 360 is we have this Arise to Your Health segment, which really focuses on the holistic approach of being healthy. So we do everything from working out to juicing to getting in shape by doing fun exercises like bouncing on a trampoline or wearing these bouncy boots on our feet when we're jumping all over the set. We've done karate, we've danced the weight off, we've done just about everything. And of course, I love when we eat on set, but we do it in a very healthy and clean way.
Myself and a good friend of mine, Jim Nolan, we built this memorial for the carpenters. And I said, Jimmy, I'm going to put a Christmas tree here in front of this memorial. So Jimmy said, let's go for a 15-foot. So I said, well, let's keep going. Let's go for a 20-foot. He says 25, I says 30. So that was how it started. Since then, it just got bigger and bigger.
I think it'll be uplifting for the people that are working down here, from the Port Authority, FDNY, NYPD, all these hundreds of construction workers. I think we all kind of need the lift. I know the construction workers do because they're here all day, every day.
You had sanitation workers, police department, fire department, Port Authority. I mean, everybody that was involved has hung some kind of an ornament on this tree. We have 17 hard hats out, one for each lost brother in the Trade Center. Also, the transparent angels up there, there's 17 angels on the tree, one for each lost electrician in the Trade Center.
Many people gave much of themselves to make tonight special for the families of our fallen comrades, those 59 trade unionists who simply went to work and did not return that night.
As the soot and dirt and ash rained down, we became one color. As we cried tears of grief and loss, we became one soul.
So we will make this commitment that in their memory, we will build Lower Manhattan better than it was before, And with their memory and in us doing that, they will never be forgotten.
My condolences, support, and prayers to all of you who have lost loved ones at the World Trade Center. And my congratulations and gratitude to all of you who have worked here so hard, tirelessly, since then. The terrorists attacked us because they thought we were weak. But now we are stronger than we ever were before. So I thank you very, very much for putting this Christmas tree here. And every time you look at it, remind yourself that this holiday, you have to celebrate it with even more enthusiasm and more dedication. Thank you, and God bless you, and God bless America.
May 3rd, 2002, Friday. We are definitely on the last lap. I'm hoping by mid-June to turn the site over to the Port Authority, and by late June, the only continued DDC involvement should be the infrastructure work in the streets.
To me, it showed the larger public who maybe doubted the ability of government and the private sector to work together, that in fact we could work together and we could accomplish something that no one, I think, really believed could be accomplished.
In June 2002, 9 months after the terrorist attacks, the recovery and cleanup at Ground Zero was drawing to an end. To mark the occasion, the city planned a solemn ceremony.
It was an event that caused hurt feelings for those who had toiled so long and so hard outside the media spotlight.
Once we heard about the closing ceremony, we were really miffed because construction trades were really left out of it.
The uniformed services, rightfully so, got their tribute, their recognition. But I always felt that the construction industry didn't get enough credit because, it was a dangerous, dangerous place, and these guys just ran down there and did the job. And they were the ones with the torches in their hands. They were the ones with the brooms in their hands. They were the guys up in the man baskets. They're the ones that cleaned it up.
And that was addressed by, I really have to say, Charlie Vichers and Bovis Lindley's. And they said, look, we did this our way. Let's end it our way. Let's let New York do what they have to do, and we're going to do what we think we have to do.
I think it's something that each of the CMs felt was important. I know the Tully people did, the Turner people, the Amec people, Bovis as well. There's no question. We all wanted to have our statement.
During the clearing of the debris, there was one of the core columns had remained more or less intact, standing in the pit. And as they cleared, as they got lower and lower, somebody put a flag on the top of it. And at the end of the recovery, we took this beam down.
So the fact that that was a grassroots movement, that gave you a lot of pride about what we were going to do that night. We all joined up in different areas, basically by locals, because it was mostly all tradespeople.
We have plumbers, electricians, iron workers, operating engineers, carpenters, laborers, we have them all.
Growing up in this neighborhood, the towers meant a lot to me. I grew up a mile north of here, and I saw them every day. And it was kind of like a closure to the falling of the towers, you know, the last piece leaving the site. Well, it was prepped by the local 40 with an oxygen lance, and they left 4 tabs, one on each corner, and then they let 4 different locals, the 79, 40, 731, and 1456. One guy from each local, and I represented the 79.
It was a very emotional ceremony. It was very quiet. A lot of people were thinking a lot and crying, including myself.
So many of us just went up and touched it. Just put your hand on it, you know. They put a black shroud over it, a wreath of flowers. These are people that their fathers and my brothers and sisters, we had all helped build the city.
Well, the next day, really, with the closing ceremony, that really was a ceremony for the government. It was a ceremony for the city and for the Port Authority, and particularly for the uniformed forces. There were construction workers involved, and they were there and they were watching it happen, but they weren't part of it. I think that's how so many people looked upon that ceremony, and yet, having had the day before, people, I think, were quite happy with that.
Ground Zero and its ugly nightmare landscape of charred debris is gone. A new tower, One World Trade Center, now soars above the site. It's more than 400 feet taller than the original Twin Towers.
In fact, its height, measured in feet, comes to a symbolic number, 1,776. 1776 is the year America declared its independence.
The Freedom Tower, as it's unofficially called, was built by many of the same men and women who worked so hard to rescue the victims of 9/11.
They also worked to safely remove the dangerous pile, while at the same time helping to give closure to the families of those who died.
They did their work tirelessly, professionally, and quietly. They were indeed the unsung heroes at Ground Zero. Thank you very much for joining us. For Julian Phillips and Gary Anthony Ramsey, I'm Debbie Turner Bell.
City agencies, state agencies, federal agencies, private sector contractors, private sector CMs, private sector engineering companies, average citizens, suppliers, all these people came together, subcontractors, everybody came together and worked in a manner in which I don't think anyone who was involved in it will ever forget.
It's history, you know, and to be part of something that was so terrible, and to help to bring that back, and it's a great feeling.
Everybody was drawn here because we had to be here, because our country was attacked. This was our way of fighting. This was our way of paying tribute to those who perished here.
I'm grateful that I was given this opportunity to help, and despite the extremes of the working conditions here, I wouldn't work anywhere else.
This is the job, clearly, that puts the DDC on the map, right? I mean, it was a small little agency that many people did not know about, and they just showed the incredible depth of their talents.
Walk around the city with that jacket on, the DDC jacket. People come up to you and go, great job, thank you.
And that it wasn't one person, it wasn't one agency, it wasn't one group. It was everyone. Everybody lost somebody there. In one way or another. Whether we lost our innocence, or whether we lost a family member or a cousin or a brother or a friend of a friend, we all lost something there. And I think I'm proud to have been a part of it, humbled to have been a part of it. And I hope that they can only read about things like that in history books.